Welcome to the Wildy West, a podcast dedicated to being a voice for wild horses. My name is Chase McGoran, and I'll be your host. Let's save these horses together. All I ask you to do is listen. Alberta's Wildies, also known as the mountain horse, are in danger. There are less than 1,500 free-roaming wild horses left in the foothills wilderness that spans the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains and borders both Banff and Jasper National Parks. They live in a glacier-carved landscape, spanning 2.2 million acres of lodgepole and jack pine forest, interspersed with cold, meandering mountain streams, coulées, and bunch grass meadows, where buttercups and Alberta's national flower, the wild rose, bloom in warmer months. The wild, untamed spirit of these iconic horses have shaped our history and our culture across continents worldwide for centuries. To see them in their natural habitat can be a life-altering and awe-inspiring experience, one not soon forgotten. To quote Winston Churchill, "There is something about the outside of a horse that is good for the inside of a man." Today we're going to talk about the role this unique breed of wild horse plays in ecotourism, attracting visitors from around the globe who eat, sleep, and spend their money in Alberta in the hopes of catching a glimpse of these magnificent creatures. My guest today is Sandy Sharkey, a wild horse photographer, rescuer, and tireless Wildy advocate in the fight to protect these magnificent horses and their right to remain living free on the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. Her career has taken her all over the world, where she has had the privilege of spending time with and photographing wild horses. She has taken pictures of the Kaimanawa wild horses of New Zealand, Garano wild horses of Portugal, and the Camargue horses found in southern France. Her photos have graced the cover of Canadian Geographic magazine, and some even adorn the walls of private collectors, who have been moved by her wild horse photography. Sandy also worked for 25 years as a radio announcer, and now uses her skills to host tourists from around the world, including the UK, Australia, and the US, helping them experience the thrill of Alberta mountain horses in their natural habitat. Hi, Sandy. Thanks so much for joining us. Would you mind telling us how you first became involved with wild horses?
Sure. I have seen wild horses in many places around the world, but my very first experience with wild horses was actually in Alberta many years ago. And I was one of the people that didn't even know that wild horses existed. And I think that can be still a problem today, and it's our job to make sure that people know that they're there. But when I first experienced them, I was in the Rocky Mountains and I was in my early 20s. And I was on a horseback riding trip through the mountains with a small group, and we were camping and living like cowboys in the mountains. And one day I became injured with my hip. So I had to stay back with my horse while the rest of the group went ahead. And while I was just sitting there in a beautiful alpine meadow with my horse, big giant draft horse, his name was Jim, and he was munching away on grass, and it was just a beautiful afternoon. And I was lying on my back in this alpine meadow, and all of a sudden the earth shook. And I thought it was an earthquake, and I jumped up, and a herd of wild horses ran by me. And it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen in my life. And I then was absolutely hooked, and I realized that this was going to come around, and I was going to revisit this experience again one day. I didn't know how or when, because I was working in radio at the time, and I went back home to Ottawa where I live, and just, went back from my holiday, went back into my job. And then when my radio career started to slide, because that industry is just a fantastic industry, but after a while you start to move on a little bit. And when that happened, I was able to start revisiting my passion for wild horses.
That's actually such an amazing story. I love it so much. I also had no idea wild horses existed at all in Alberta until I went out with my mom one day, and she went, "You have to see this." And yeah, we saw a couple of them, and it's really quite something to see wild horses for the first time, right? It's a completely different experience than seeing them at a barn. So
it's so true. It's so true. Like the very first time you see wild horses, it has the ability to, in some ways, I know this sounds kind of funny, but it has the ability to change your life. And I think part of it is because we all feel that way, that freedom is a big part of our lives, and, independence and just that wild spirit. I think we all have that in us. And when we see wild horses for the first time, I think it touches something inside of us, and we realize, wow, there's a part of my life that I might be missing out on, and I need to rekindle that wild spirit in me.
Yeah, absolutely. Would you say like this was the moment that started your career with professional equine photography?
Absolutely. I mean, I had been dabbling in photography, but not in any serious way whatsoever. And then when I saw the wild horses, I didn't have a camera with me, but that's okay, because I think a lot of times when you do become a professional photographer, you're seeing something that's incredible. You're now more worried about, do I have my exposure right? Is my shutter speed fast enough? And sometimes it takes you away from that moment. So it's okay to not have a camera too. But I started to photograph wildlife, and while I was working in radio, I was on the morning show, which gave me a lot of time, because where most people were working 9 to 5, I was working from 5 a.m. to 9 a.m. So I had a lot of time on my hands throughout the day to get my camera going. And I would just go into the woods near where I lived, and I started photographing birds and deer. And then eventually, always with that in the back of my mind, I've got to get out and start photographing wild horses. And then when I started to do that, I realized how powerful photography can be to raise awareness and raise some of the issues that are going on with wild horses.
Yeah, for sure. I did some research last night. I saw some of your photos in there. Absolutely beautiful. I really liked. Really, I don't know anything about photography, but I really like looking at them. So,
well, thanks.
You're very welcome. It's my understanding that you started photographing wild horses in a professional capacity just under 12 years ago. And you recently achieved getting your second cover for Canadian Geographic using a picture of the Albertan Wildies. Has that helped towards your goals of saving these majestic animals?
Absolutely. Oh my goodness. Anytime that you can use your photography to raise awareness. I think photography has so many layers to it, and it does a lot. So it makes people just smile. Like, for example, you were just talking about looking at my wild horse photos, and it just brought you maybe some, seconds of joy.
Absolutely.
And photography can do that, but most importantly, photography can raise awareness for issues and, help to change the world in so many ways. When we see photographs of African wildlife that's endangered, or of course wild horses, birds that are almost on their way out because of pressures from mankind. And compelling photography can hopefully reach into people's hearts and make them look into the layers of the story behind that photograph. So having wild horses on 2 issues of Canadian Geographic, specifically Albertan wild horses, has been an incredible forum for people to just, walk by their magazine rack and then be stopped by this beautiful wild horse. First of all, they will look at that and just be drawn to it. But secondly, they're going to read the story and they're going to find out that wild horses do exist. And then they're going to discover that wild horses are in trouble. So anytime you can get that kind of exposure through photography is incredible. And I was very, very fortunate and honored that Canadian Geographic put 2 of my photos on issues this year.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I know, especially growing up for me and stuff, whenever I would think about horses, I would just think they were domesticated animals, right? I didn't really believe that they were still wild, that you'd still be able to see herds of horses running against, the backdrop of a mountain or whatever, right? So it was really eye-opening for me when I first saw a wild horse and I went, oh my goodness, wow. So yeah, what would you say the appeal of seeing the Alberta wild horses is? Like, why do adventurers come from around the world to see them?
Well, one of the greatest things about the internet and all the social media that's out there now is that it's a lot easier today to raise awareness about these animals than it was before. And so there are people that are all around the world that are just so fascinated by wild horses. I will acknowledge that most people have never seen wild horses in real life. But when they see the photos of the wild horses from whether it be Alberta or Sable Island or the American Mustang or the wild horses of Australia or New Zealand, it's really brought the international community together with a love for these animals. And the Alberta wild horses have an incredible appeal to the rest of the world. And I will give a lot of that credit to our good friend Daryl Glover and Help Alberta Wildies Society, whose Facebook page has over 500,000 followers. And these are people from all over the world. So why are they touched by these stories? Because again, I think as I alluded to before, it instills, there's a free spirit in all of us, and seeing these wild horses brings that out in us. Not only that, they're absolutely magnificently beautiful animals. And we find that there are things that we can identify with wild horses, especially the bonds that they have with their families. These animals need to have their families around them. To them, family is everything. And so when mankind raises its heavy hand and rounds them up or tries to reduce their numbers in any way, the first thing they do is they separate the families, which is just something that I think touches all of us because we can identify with that. I mean, can you imagine, your brothers, your sisters, your parents, all of a sudden just being torn away from you? So there's a lot of identifiability with wild horses and what they're going through. I think that's a big part of why people are so compelled by these animals.
Yeah, for sure. And going back to Daryl, he's actually the one who inspired me to start this whole podcast idea. So
fantastic.
Yeah, he's touched everyone around the world, really. So
he really has.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let me just find where I am real quick. Here we go. Other than the obvious benefit of saving the lives of hundreds of wild horses, how can wild horse tourism bring money into Alberta?
It's kind of an ugly secret. It's an ugly secret and not a fantastic thing that the government will acknowledge. They don't want to acknowledge that this is happening. And it's happening in droves. I have been hosting retreats and bringing people out on wild horse adventures for a few years in Alberta. And there have been people that have joined us from all over the United States, UK. Last year we had a guest who came all the way from Australia.
Oh, wow.
Now, when they come to Alberta, they're flying here, they're renting vehicles, they're spending money in hotels, they're spending money in restaurants, gas stations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There is a booming industry everywhere that wild horses live because people really, really, really love them and want to travel to go and see them. So if there was a study, it wouldn't be done by the Alberta government, but if there was a study, an independent study that could be done to suggest how much money adventurers and people from around the world are spending in Alberta just specifically to come out and see the wild horses, I think it would blow a lot of minds. And I think that, the Alberta tourism industry should really be picking up on this and encouraging people. Like if you go to Sundre, the small town of Sundre, which is pretty much the gateway to wild horse world in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains in Alberta, when you go to Sundre, you'll find there is a museum, and it's kind of hidden. It's funny because it's a small town, but it's not on the main drag. It's kind of, a couple of streets over, and it's a museum of some, I suppose, history of the area. And plastered on the outside of this museum is this huge mural of wild horses with clear love for the wild horses. So I see that, and I had to, kind of find it down a couple of residential streets, and there it is. So what I'm seeing is that this needs to come out to the fore. It needs to be, something that's more obvious that it is a source of revenue for small towns like Sundre, not to mention Calgary, and all the places that could possibly benefit from revenue from tourism. I would love to see a sign outside of Sundre, welcome to Sundre, wild horse country, your gateway to wild horse country, and have hotels and restaurants, maybe having some postcards or brochures or selling wild horse related merchandise. Like embrace it because it's already there. It exists. So embrace it and start furthering it. And that's only going to help the cause of wild horses, of course. So I think that that's an area of growth that needs to be looked at.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is something just magical about being able to walk into a fantasy world that feels like it might be straight out of Lord of the Rings or something, and it's real life, So absolutely, it makes sense to me why there is, such a big market. Could you remind us what exactly it is that the government is trying to do with these horses, or to these horses, I should say?
Well, let's start off with the fact that there are not very many wild horses to begin with. The Alberta Mountain horse population hovers around 1,100 animals, and this is over 2 million acres of wilderness in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. 2 million acres.
Yeah.
So if you think of it that way, it's ridiculous that there is any concern that there are too many wild horses. There are not enough of them. The wild horses of Alberta, unlike many areas in the world where wild horses exist, live in a very, very challenging landscape where, of course, winters can be very difficult. But the number one issue impacting the wild horses of Alberta is the predators. There's a very robust prey-predator balance in Alberta with the grizzlies, the mountain lions, the wolves that do take the foals in the spring and then take, sick or elderly horses. And so as people who are deeply in love with wild horses and advocate for them, it's kind of at cross purposes to say that this is actually a fantastic thing, because what it is it's Mother Nature managing these animals. In the United States, in the American West, where there are thousands of American Mustangs, the livestock industry has pretty much eliminated all the predators. And so, the numbers of the wild horses are affected by that. In Alberta, the predators keep the numbers so low that it's unconscionable to consider that the Alberta government would reduce the numbers of those horses. Why are they reducing the numbers of horses? Well, it's a cliche, but all you have to really do is follow the money, because profit-driven industries don't want the wild horses around. And when I talk about profit-driven industries, those include any industry that profits from natural resources, whether it be logging, mining. The number one catalyst for reducing the numbers of wild horses in Alberta is absolutely the private ranchers that graze their cattle on the public lands. And so they consider the wild horses as some kind of competition for their cattle grazing, when in fact they have absolutely no documented scientific proof that that's happening. And one of the things that anti-wild horse groups try to do, and in many cases, unfortunately, do quite effectively, is they scapegoat the wild horse for damage to rangeland. Because when members of the public start to see their public lands being trampled down and damaged in any way, the anti-wild horse groups will absolutely start to put out the narrative that it's the wild horses that are causing the damage, when in fact the exact opposite is true, and it is the cattle that causes the damage. So what I would like to say to the Alberta government is to show the proof of the reasoning behind them trying to reduce the numbers of wild horses. And they cannot provide it. They just cannot provide it.
Yeah, and I think that might be kind of something we're trying to prove with this, this podcast and everything. So hopefully we can get that debate started with even more people than have already been involved. So do you think there is a need to designate the Alberta mountain horse as a naturalized species versus feral?
Absolutely. This is something that Alberta wild horse advocates have been fighting for a long time, with, thankfully, a lot of people around the world who are signing on to pressuring the Alberta government to do this as well. The Alberta mountain horse historically has been there for hundreds of years. It is completely a species unto itself now. And in other areas, this has been a successful thing, especially when you look at the wild horses of Sable Island. So when Parks Canada took over the stewardship for Sable Island in 2013 to turn it into a national park reserve, they gave the wild horses their own designation of naturalized species, acknowledging the hundreds of years that these animals have existed there and have now become a specific breed of horse. So the same thing needs to happen to the Alberta mountain horses. Why has it not happened? Because the Alberta government wants to be able to manage these horses in any way that they feel that they can, in deference to the profit-driven industries that want the horses gone. The last thing they're going to do is raise them up and give them this title, because that also suggests some sort of protection. Well, that's exactly what we want. With the small amount of number of Alberta mountain horses that exist, their right to be there after hundreds and hundreds of years, their tiny number due to such a robust predator balance and terrible winters, giving them the title of naturalized species acknowledges them as a specific Alberta mountain horse. They are a specific breed. The word feral is the favorite word used by any anti-wild horse groups, because feral has just a vibe about it. It has a feeling attached to it of this animal doesn't belong here. This animal is less value. All of the different narratives that are attached to the word feral are only used by anti-wild horse groups. You will never, ever see an anti-wild horse group acknowledge a wild horse as a naturalized species or as an animal that is allowed to exist without pressures from mankind. They will throw the word feral out because in the eyes of the public, they sometimes achieve their goal of having these horses be considered less than valuable because they attach the word feral to them. So, what we should all start doing, and I don't think there's a law against this. I just thought of this right now. I suggest we just all start calling them a naturalized species. I mean, who's going to stop us, right? Whether the government buys into it or not, let's just call them a naturalized species from here on in. And then eventually the public will acknowledge that they're a naturalized species, and then hopefully the government will go, okay, we're throwing up our hands, they're a naturalized species.
That would be really nice. Because for me, the word feral, I think like disease, and it's really a negative word, right? You think like a feral dog, you would immediately be like, oh, that has rabies, right? Like it's really horrifically diseased. So the word feral does do a lot of damage, even just to people who don't know anything, right? So,
well, exactly, Chase. You are just commenting exactly the way that everyone feels about the word feral, which is exactly why the government uses it. Because the less people that love wild horses makes their job a lot easier. So they're going to do whatever they can to demean these animals. So if you go to the Alberta government website, that there's a couple of pages are dedicated to the horses that live in the foothills. They are always going to be referred to as feral, always.
Yep, absolutely. Well, let's move on to a little bit of a happier topic. I understand you were involved in the rescue of a Wildie foal named Dusk. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, wow, that was an incredible experience. I was hosting a retreat. We had 10 women. The retreat had just begun. Everyone had just arrived at a lodge in Sundre, and the next day we were all headed out to see wild horses. So the women were there getting to know each other, and the phone rang at the lodge, and it was a woman who had called the lodge because she was out photographing Alberta wild horses, and she noticed that a foal who was probably 2 or 3 days old had been rejected by his band. And, the reasons leading to this are varied, and there's lots of theories on it, but it does occasionally happen. It's not often, but it happens. So this little foal was trying to nurse from his mom. She was not having it. And then he was going to the other members of the family band and trying to nurse from them. And of course, they were not having it either. And occasionally there was a little kick going on where the little baby was being tossed into the air. So this was a woman named Bonnie Rideout, and thank goodness she was there. And she called the lodge because she knew that I was there, and she knew that I had a connection with Daryl Glover from Help Alberta Wilding Society. So when she explained the situation to me and where the foal was with the band, the geographic region, I called Daryl, Barb, and Carmela from Help Alberta Wilding Society. Hopped in their truck. It was about a 90-minute drive for them to get to where we were. And one of the retreat members and we drove to the family band, and we saw what was happening, and it was horrifying to us. We had to stay there, and we had to watch this, and we saw this baby, being rejected constantly, and it was just terrible to watch. So this big white truck pulls up, and out Daryl gets, and he has no time for pleasantries whatsoever. Hi, Sandy, how are you? None of that. And by this point, the band and the foal had disappeared behind a stand of trees, and Daryl and Carmela got out of the vehicle. They ran behind the stand of trees. They appeared, honestly, less than a minute later with this foal in their arms. I don't know how they did it because I couldn't see because of the trees. I don't know how they got that foal so quickly, but they did. And he was in the back of that truck and brought back to their ranch. A nurse mare was found the very next morning through the power of social media and 500,000 followers. A nurse mare was found the next morning. I was so honored to have the honor of naming this guy, and I named him Dusk because that is a absolutely spectacular time to be out with wild horses. And when the sun is going down, that's pretty much when we found this guy. So we named him Dusk. He ended up with a nurse mare for a while off-site, and then returned in the fall to Daryl's ranch. And now he's been given the honor of Wild Horse of Alberta, Wild Mountain Horse of Alberta Ambassador. And he's coming up to 2 years old, and he's just a spectacular boy.
Absolutely. It's such a nice story. And watching Daryl work to rescue these horses it's really funny. There's no it's right down to business immediately as soon as he gets on site. It's really something to watch. But
you were involved in a rescue with Daryl too, were you not?
Not me personally, but my son was. So yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
oh, fantastic.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
I was in school, and then I come home and I'm getting all these stories, and I was like, oh my goodness. So yeah.
Fantastic.
Absolutely. What other reasons should people care about these horses?
Well, I think that if we stop caring about wildlife, we're in trouble. Our natural spaces and our wildlife is diminishing before our eyes. Wild horses are wildlife. So they have a category unto themselves, absolutely, but they are wildlife. And when our wildlife is starting to lose its value, and our wild spaces are losing ground as well, we're in trouble. We absolutely have to protect wild horses, along with protecting wolves, protecting bears, protecting wolverines, lynx, river otters, and all of the animals that the Ministry of Forestry and Parks seems to have in its crosshairs right now. It's so important. Did you know that 70% of the wildlife around the world has been lost in the last 20 years? 70%.
Wow.
It's unconscionable to think of it that way. So yes, people need to have jobs, and yes, there are pressures on our natural resources for those jobs, but there needs to be more compromise, and there has to be some attention, more attention paid to the protection of these ecosystems that are so important. They're the heartbeat of the earth, and the wild horses are a big part of that.
Yeah, for sure. And what can we do to help in this fight for the lives of the horses?
Use our voices. Every single person that ever talks to me about feeling helpless, or that they've written a letter and they didn't get a response, they've written an elected official and heard nothing back. Those contacts, whether they be emails or phone calls, are all recorded by law. They have to be. Elected officials have to pay attention to huge masses of people that are trying to make a point or trying to elicit change. So the most powerful tool each and every one of us has is our voice. So use it, and use it in a very, effective way, in that you don't have to know, the entire history of wild horses. You don't have to dig. You can. I mean, I would love it if everyone did their research and learned, the 100 years of history behind wild horses. But for a simple note to send to the Premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith, the Minister of Forestry and Parks, Todd Loewen, what you need to do is just indicate that you are absolutely against them reducing the numbers of wild horses, keeping in mind that there's just hovering around 1,000, 1,100 of them over a couple of million acres, with so many predators around, that this is incredibly unconscionable and unscientific that they're considering reducing the numbers of horses. That's really all that people need to get across, and that they're tired of the small number of profit-driven industries and individuals that are running ramshod and having their voices heard over the thousands and thousands of people that are actually for the wild horses. So use your voice, use it regularly, every day, email, phone call, and as well, another way that you can really help too is when you see posts that are about the wild horse fight with information and calls to action. Take a second to share those posts. Anytime you see them, just share, 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 because the net is getting wider. It's like ripples in a pond, and it's getting bigger and it's getting bigger. And once it gets so huge that the government can't overlook it, then they will have to respond in kind. And hopefully that means that they will leave those wild horses alone for generations to come.
So essentially, don't get discouraged if you feel like the government's ignoring your voice, because they can't forever, right?
Exactly. And that was exactly what I was trying to say. I was really glad. I'm glad that you summarized like that, because people do get defeated. There is such a thing as compassion fatigue, where people get tired. If they don't see results, they just walk away. But keep doing it. Keep doing it. If it's 1 minute out of your day to, share a post or write a 3-line email, I think that that's very little effort to consider the bigger picture of saving wild horses. In the United States, I'm involved with a lot of advocate groups down there as well. And the population of the United States is over 300 million people. So down there, we use a hashtag that is hashtag, but I'm just one person, said 300 million people. And when you think about it that way, you think about everybody realizing the power of their voice and collectively what it can achieve. So we hope for the same thing for the Alberta Mountain wild horses.
Yeah. It's just because you're one person doesn't mean your voice isn't heard, right? That's kind of how I see your hashtag, and it makes a lot of sense, because I'm one person and somehow I'm doing all of this. So.
Exactly. Look what you're doing. I mean, I got you up super early on a Saturday morning.
Yeah.
And you're just pretty much new to the whole wild horse thing. And now you're doing a series of podcasts to try and save them. And you're one guy.
Yeah, I'm just one guy.
It's fantastic. Look at Daryl Glover and his wife, Barb. They are 2 people that started this organization, Help Alberta Wildies Society. They now have 500,000 people following them. Mm-hmm. But Daryl, at one point was a baby, then he was a student, and then he was a teenager, and he's one guy. And look at the influence he's had. It's incredible when you consider it that way.
Well, and you're one person, and you've been all over with your photography. You've done radio, and you yourself have helped save a wild foal. So one person really can make a difference. You just got to speak up, right?
Exactly, Chase. And in Alberta, we are using 2 hashtags now, because hashtags tend to help things go viral and really help to spread awareness. So in Alberta, we're using hashtag voices for wild horses. And the second hashtag is hashtag hands off our wild horses. So when people are listening to this and they want to get involved with social media and spreading awareness, please use both of those hashtags.
Absolutely. So if it's just another way your voice is heard, is if you just use a couple of hashtags. It doesn't take a lot of time. So, well, exactly. Thank you so much for your time. It was really, really interesting and really, really insightful seeing your perspective on everything with the wild horses and everything that's going on here. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to come on and interview. It was really nice. So thank you.
I would like to turn the thanks around back to you. For you to do this is incredible, and I adore what you're doing, and I can't thank you enough for helping to spread awareness for Alberta mountain horses and their protection, and to stop this crazy cull that the Alberta government is planning. Thank you so much.
Oh, I'm just doing my part, right? Every voice matters.
You're just one person.
Yeah, I'm just one person.
Thank you, Chase.
Thank you very much, Sandy.
Thank you so much for listening to today's interview with Sandy Sharkey. The amount of support we have received from you has really meant a lot, and it brings us closer to seeing these animals saved. A huge thank you to everyone that I was lucky enough to sit down with and interview this season. If you want to help, there are a ton of different things you can do. If you live in Canada, you can write to your local member of parliament or directly to the Minister of Parks in Alberta. If you aren't as comfortable doing that, or you don't live in Canada, you may want to follow the Help Alberta Wildies Society or HAWS on Facebook to get more involved and see what other things you can do. There's also the Alberta Mountain Horse Preservation Society on Facebook that you may also want to go check out and see what they're doing to help. The information for both of these groups can be found in the show notes for this episode, and if you haven't already, I highly recommend giving them a follow. And of course, every like and comment means a lot, and by clicking subscribe on YouTube, you're helping us out even more. Every little bit truly does help, and it allows me to show tangible proof that people care. If you would be so kind as to share this with friends or family that you think might be interested in this topic, or who you think would want to help, I would really appreciate it. If you would like to follow us on social media, you can find us on Twitter or X and Blue Sky using the tag @TheWildyWest. For any business inquiries, please contact us at thewildiewest@gmail.com. Join me next week as I interview Sam Peterson about the thought-provoking letter she sent to the Minister of Indigenous Affairs regarding these magnificent creatures. I'm your host, Chase McGoran. Thank you once again for listening to The Wildy West.